So just to quickly introduce ourselves, we are a research and policy centre based at the Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford. We investigate how governments partner with the private and social sectors to improve social outcomes. So part of this involves looking at innovative financing tools such as social impact bonds and outcomes funds. We combine our own research with a multifaceted engagement programme to ensure that the insights that we and others around the world are generating can be made accessible and can be used in policy and in practice. So we launched this webinar series back in January last year to create a public platform for policymakers, for practitioners and researchers from around the world to come together and engage in the latest findings in the field. These sessions are grounded in research, but most importantly, we want to facilitate an open discussion and really look at the practical considerations for those working on the ground. In terms of dates coming up, I'd say save the date for the 8th and 9th of September. We have our annual Social Outcomes Conference. We've just closed the call for papers, but it's going to be 2 days, really exciting, where we're bringing everyone from around sectors for all kinds of sessions. So yeah, save the date for that. I'd also encourage you to sign up to our newsletter, which we can post the link in the chat later for any kind of updates on news and upcoming events. So coming back to today, we're going to start with a bit of context setting by our academic director, Mara. Then we'll have an introduction to the outcomes-based contracting readiness frameworks by social finance director, Louise Saville. Then we're going to hand over to Caitlin Williams and Maria Alejandra Orea from social finance, who will be sharing the key findings from these frameworks. Then for the second part of the session, we'll pass on to my colleague, Andrea, who will moderate the panel discussion. So we'll be asking our international group of guest speakers to reflect on the practical considerations, the challenges on the ground, and examples of best practice for ecosystem capacity and readiness. We're also going to be thinking about how to build capacity for outcomes-based contracting at ecosystem level and at institutional level. We like to keep these sessions interactive, so we will stop throughout the session for questions. So do feel free to pose questions in the chat or raise your hand, and we can unmute you at any point during the session. Please note that we are recording this session and we will share the recording online after the session. Final thing, it's always really nice to see everyone's faces. So if you can and if you want to, do keep your cameras on and just a reminder to stay muted while the speaking. Amazing. I think that's all the housekeeping reminders out the way for the session. I know we've got a really great discussion ahead. So really looking forward to hearing all about these frameworks, which were just published a day ago. So we're all really excited about this. Yeah, I'll hand over to our first presenter, Mara, who will first set some context for us for the session. So over to you, Mara.
Thank you, Laura. I just want to spend 2 minutes really to put this framework into context and explain why we embarked in this particular piece of work with colleagues from social finance and who are they are aimed to. So at the GoLab, we are always asked, the typical question we'd ask is, do social impact bonds work? Are they better than a grant? Are they worth the extra effort? And of course, this is a misspecified question. Some of them work brilliantly, some of them don't. In the same way as you can say a grant works or doesn't work. It depends a lot on the context, the situation, the particular design. And clearly, although we can't answer that question with a yes or no, one thing that there is consensus around is that context really, really matters. Everybody says, oh, context is really important. The culture of an organization, of the organizations that are involved are very important. So this piece of work was an opportunity for us to take stock about which are the elements of a context and what are the behaviors, culture, norms, skills that are present in an organization that helps an ecosystem or organizations that deliver service within an ecosystem to work with an outcome focus more easily. And for organizations who venture themselves and government ecosystem who venture themselves in exploring how we can organize the delivery of services around outcomes and holding organization accountable for outcomes and have an agile way of managing the program. What is ahead of us in terms of things that we will learn along the way, things that we need to change and strengthen. So these two frameworks are have been designed and are presented as a sort of map on this journey. Like as individuals, we grow, we learn, organization ecosystem grow and change. And for those who want to work on with an outcome focus, here are some hints, some insights that come from the experience of those who have done this before. And we hope that this will help organization and ecosystem to organize their work and accelerate their learning. So I'm really keen that this framework is seen not as a checklist exercise about, oh, should I work with this organization ready or not? This is a learning agenda. Organizations who want to work with an outcome focus can expect to strengthen some muscles in these directions. And so to do so more effectively, this is a picture of what lies ahead in terms of skills that you will be strengthening. So the frameworks are offered in this spirit, and we look forward to welcome feedback from our audience and users of this framework to see if they are helpful or how we can improve and make them more helpful for you going forward. So I'll stop here and I'll pass over to our main speakers.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Mara. And now over to you, Louise, to give a bit more context to the framework.
Thank you very much, Laura. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and it's been a real pleasure to work on these frameworks over the last few months with colleagues at GoLab and actually many experienced colleagues and stakeholders from the broader sector. So before we start, and I'm going to hand over to my colleagues who've really led this thinking, Caitlin and Maria, in a second. But I thought it might be helpful to just spend a moment or two really reminding ourselves of what we're talking about when we're talking about outcomes-based partnerships. So outcomes-based partnerships really are really quite different to other forms of payment by results contracts in that they shift the basis of payments away from more conventional milestones around activities being completed and towards some form of demonstrated change in service user lives. That's quite a radical shift in practice because it opens up a whole set of flexibility for service providers when they're contracted well, to really learn in real time about what's working, what's not working, and to experiment a little bit with how to achieve better outcomes for the populations that are being served. So I'm a director at Social Finance, as Laura said, and we've been working with these kinds of contracts for a very long time. We've been working in this space and helped to originate the impact bond concept over 12 years ago now, and have subsequently been involved in nearly 100 contracts in terms of either the design, the development, the contracting, the delivery. But these frameworks draw from a much broader set of experience as well. And we're really grateful to the contributions of other organizations, other practitioners, other government actors, and researchers in this space for the work that they've done in laying the foundations for these frameworks. The two frameworks that we're going to talk about today are really a consolidation of both existing frameworks that were already in the market, but also a whole set of learnings from evaluations, from case studies, and from conversations with practitioners in this space. So very much, we hope, a group effort, and in that, we hope that will sort of maximize their relevance and use to a really broad range of contexts. So the two frameworks we're going to present today, the first focuses on the ecosystem level. And really that framework aims to support governments and other funders to identify ways to strengthen national or subnational ecosystems to support the use of outcomes-based partnerships to drive better outcomes for priority populations. And we'll talk about how that might start as part of a journey in launching the first couple of contracts, but also the journey that an ecosystem might go on to really try to mainstream the use of this kind of approach as a way to drive better outcomes and drive value for public spending. The second framework that we'll then present drills down to the level of the service provider and looks at what processes and practices might be relevant for service providers to develop, those muscles that Mara just mentioned, to enable them to deliver better outcomes through outcomes-based partnerships. So we've written that specifically with service providers in mind. It might also be helpful to their potential investors and advisors, if relevant. And outcomes funders may also find some of the competencies that we explore in that framework helpful when thinking about how they might support the development of delivery capacity within a particular ecosystem. As Mara said, the aim of these frameworks is very much to support the use of outcomes-based partnerships by a broader range of actors in a broader range of settings. The intention is not to act as any kind of checklist or gating item that unless you reach a particular threshold, you can't participate. Quite the opposite. We're hoping that these frameworks will inform and support organizations and a whole range of market participants to think deeply about what skills and learning might be helpful in strengthening their use of these kinds of partnerships, ultimately for the benefit of vulnerable populations. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Maria, who's going to talk a little bit about the methodology that we use and give you a bit of an overview of the ecosystem framework.
Thank you so much, Louise, for that introduction. So as you said, in the next couple of minutes, we want to dedicate some time to cover two main points. Firstly, we want to give you an overview of the methodology we used to build both frameworks. And secondly, we want to explain how each framework is structured across different dimensions and also levels of maturity or expertise. Let's begin with the methodology. So as Louise was saying, both frameworks are the result of a very rigorous process to consolidate, compare, and synthesize insights from multiple practitioners in the field. Our starting point was an initial review of the published literature around a range of instruments, including results-based finance, impact bonds, payment by results, and many others. And this initial review allowed us to understand two things. So the first one is that most of the literature actually focuses on the case for the use of these instruments or the design processes, and not on the competencies of service providers to succeed in outcome-based partnerships or the characteristics in an ecosystem to enable their use. We also identified some differences in terms of the volume of published work between service providers and the ecosystem readiness categories, which led us to take different methodological approaches for building each framework. In the case of the ecosystem readiness workstream, we focused on conducting an in-depth comparison between the most relevant frameworks in the market to find similarities, differences, and even gaps. This comparison included ECORI's Dream Framework and also Instiglio's Guide for Effective RBF Strategies, among many others, and was also supplemented by the review of specific case studies and conversations with key practitioners in the field. In terms of the service provider workstream, we use semi-structured key informant interviews with experts, including service providers currently working in outcome-based partnerships or organizations supporting them, and also supplemented that information with additional insights from evaluation and case studies as well. Finally, we organized 2 workshops with a group of experts who reviewed the draft frameworks a couple of weeks ago and provided very generous feedback in each case. Moving on to the frameworks, we want to start explaining how the ecosystem readiness framework is structured. So as Louise mentioned before, this framework is aims to support government policymakers and donor agencies to better understand the factors that facilitate the beginning, the expansion, and the consolidation of outcome-based partnerships within an ecosystem. It is important to say that although the framework addresses the competencies of multiple stakeholders in the ecosystem, including service providers, evaluators, investors if they are needed, among other stakeholders, it acknowledges that governments have a very important role to play in developing the ecosystem due to its supportive role, and therefore the framework emphasizes government-related competencies above all. The framework is structured across 5 top-level dimensions that build on and expand ECORI's Dream Framework for social impact bonds by integrating the perspectives and also the views from different stakeholders. And in this order of ideas, the 5 top-level dimensions which are included in this ecosystem readiness framework are: first, the demand from outcome funders, the regulatory framework, the economic and political context, the availability of data, and also the market capacity. Moreover, the framework also divides the different competencies and conditions across 3 levels of ecosystem maturity. The first level is the ecosystem foundations, which illustrates the key competencies to begin using outcome-based partnerships and launching the first couple of pilots within an ecosystem. The second level is the ecosystem expansion, which provides the competencies to expand the use of outcome-based partnerships beyond the first couple of pilots or the first pilot sectors. And finally, the ecosystem consolidation level includes those competencies to consolidate outcome-based partnerships as a mainstream tool to address different social challenges in a country or in a given context. Beyond this general explanation, we want to give you a preview of the framework, and to that end, we want to show you the key necessary competencies for the ecosystem foundation level. So first, at this stage of the ecosystem development, it is very likely that a group of government, donor agencies, or philanthropies is leading the first pilots as outcome funders. This is a group that understands the differences between commissioning outcome-based partnerships compared to other types of contract. This group is also willing to trial this new mechanism and is also able to provide funding for the design and to pay for outcomes. Additionally, the ecosystem national regulation may not explicitly include procurement and contracting of outcome-based partnership at this stage, and in some cases may even inhibit the use of these instruments. In these situations, outcome funders and other stakeholders may need to identify workarounds to launch the first pilots in the ecosystems. In terms of the economic and political context, it is important that non-state actors participate in the provision of social services, and also that they have confidence in outcomes funders' ability to pay for outcomes, and confidence in the contractual rules in the event of unforeseen circumstances. Data is also an important factor, and especially data to assess population needs, to cost the different outcomes, and also to determine or to establish the value for money case is necessary at this stage of the ecosystem development. Stakeholders at this stage may agree to use proxy information if in case historic data is not available, or even gather data during the first months of program implementation to this end. And finally, a group of service providers and investors, if they are needed, may be also pioneering the implementation of the first pilots. It is important that this group of stakeholders has full clarity of their respective roles and responsibilities within the partnership, that they share a common vision of success, and that they also work under a collaborative cross-sector approach. I will stop here with the ecosystem readiness framework and let my colleague Caitlin guide you through the service provider framework.
Amazing, thanks Maria. Thank you everyone. So the service provider framework can be thought of as sitting within the broader ecosystem framework. It aims to help service providers identify the competencies they need at different levels of engagement with outcomes-based partnerships. When we say service providers, we're talking about the organizations directly delivering outcomes on the ground, the tangible changes in people's lives. Other organizations, such as intermediaries and investors, are really important and might be part of a delivery consortium, but they're not the primary focus of this framework. Unlike other work, this framework covers the competencies to bid for outcomes-based opportunities and deliver in those partnerships. So it assumes that a government or donor has already designed the program. As you can see, we've grouped the competencies into 5 dimensions. They are strategic fit, leadership and decision-making, partnership working, data and evidence, and finance and systems. And then we've structured the framework into 3 levels. The first covers what are the foundational competencies needed to get started in an outcomes-based partnership. And then we move to considering what are the competencies that need to be built during implementation, if they're not already present. And finally, what are the competencies needed to embed an outcomes focus into the ways of working of an organization? And you'll see that across every dimension and at every level, there is a cross-cutting theme of learning, adaptation, and innovation. This is about the culture of the organization, understanding that things might not be perfect first time and always looking for improvements. Now, to show you at a very high level what this looks like, I'm picking the leadership and decision-making dimension and then taking you across the 3 levels. So to get started, you need the commitment of senior management to focus delivery on achieving outcomes rather than intermediate outputs, and to empower their staff to do the same. And then at the level of the delivery consortium, you also need senior managers who can interpret financial and delivery performance data. So if there's just one service provider in the partnership, then this competency needs to be held with them. But if there are more, if there are intermediaries, if there are investors, if there are other service providers who are delivering as part of a consortium, then it might be held elsewhere. That's why it's in italics. As we move across the levels, more decision-making authority moves closer to frontline delivery. The use of data and evidence in decision-making becomes universal, and leaders are able to represent and advocate for their programs effectively in governance meetings. If you look at the detail of the frameworks now as they've recently been published, you'll see that there are descriptors attached to each of these competencies to illustrate what they look like in real life. And then in the last level, there are no competencies which can be held at the consortium level, because here it's about embedding outcomes-based ways of working throughout the organization, really making it part of the DNA of the organization. So this is a very high-level overview of the frameworks. We'd really welcome your comments, feedback, questions. Above everything, as Louise said, these are tools to be used, and we hope they don't sit on the shelf. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Caitlin. Yeah, thanks very much. Well, we've got quite a few minutes now to leave for questions and reflections. And I think something that we find really important about, oh, sorry, I might have lost connection. Can everyone hear me still?
We can hear you, Jess.
Okay.
Laura. And Mariale, would you mind stop sharing your screen, please? Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, well, something that's really important about this session is to make it interactive. And we've got all kinds of, practitioners and policymakers and other researchers on the line. So if anyone has any reflections, if there's anything, that's been said that you resonate with, feel free to raise your hand, put something in the chat. Because I'm sure there's a lot of kind of reflections here that would resonate with a lot of people across the field. And there's plenty of people I can see joining from across the world, which is so wonderful to see. So I guess to give a couple minutes for everyone to think, if I could come to you, Louise, for a question. I think, your frameworks build on a lot of evidence that's already out there, and there kind of seems to be a generally quite broad consensus, in the literature around key conditions. Did you find in doing the research, specifically kind of the consultation with stakeholders, was there anything that's surprising that came out, anything you didn't expect, new and different from what you'd seen already?
It's a really interesting question. And actually, I think one of the things that was really gratifying actually was that certainly at the level of the ecosystem development, there was actually a huge amount of consensus across a really quite broad set of stakeholders as to what the preconditions were, both at the very early stages of the market to get the first couple of contracts launched, but also actually around then what those really sort of fundamental building blocks might look like to then embed outcomes-based partnerships as a more kind of systematic way of working. I think there's certainly, I think, some regional differences around some of the more technical areas, whether we could get very technical around some of the kind of legal basis for particularly public procurement decisions. We don't, particularly in the framework, but I think we're certainly aware that particularly in relation to regulatory aspects, that can look very different in places like Latin America that use one set of legal approach versus a more case law approach that's maybe used in other contexts in Europe and elsewhere. So I think that was really interesting to see. I don't know, I mean, I should probably defer to my colleague Mariali, who led a lot of that specific research, to see if there was anything particularly that came out of the workshops that wasn't in the framework review.
Yes, Louise, I guess probably one point which is worth mentioning, which is the enabling conditions for non-state actors to participate in outcome-based partnerships. So frameworks include that these factors an important point to develop an ecosystem, but something that we learned from the different case studies that we reviewed and also from different conversations with practitioners was that sometimes these non-state actors, meaning service providers or investors, or any organization who wants to play those roles, actually may face important constraints to participate in outcome-based partnerships, and that was not very well reflected or very strongly reflected in the existing framework. So that is probably a point that we try to shape in this framework as well, based on the learnings that several stakeholders have had in different ecosystems.
Caitlin, is there anything you'd like to add at the service provider level? I'm really conscious that actually much less had been written historically about the service provider competencies and capabilities. And so to a large extent, that's consolidating, if you like, experiences from market participants, more so than existing framework.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I was also going to start with. I think what's really exciting for me, from the service provider framework point of view, is that this is hopefully laying the basis for continuing conversations, continuing learning, like Mara said, in terms of where are we at the moment in terms of what we think is needed for different service providers in terms of their experience to date, but then also, more importantly, how can this tool help service providers going forward? I think there are always going to, I think what was really helpful in the workshop that we held was that there are always going to be slightly different nuances depending on viewpoints in terms of what kind of organization you're talking about. So, if it's a service provider who's had experience building a data system from ground up, then that becomes a really important part of their experience of an outcomes-based partnership, whereas an intermediary that's more focused on supporting the governance, say, of a program might have a slightly different view. But I hope what we've done with this framework is try and bring together a lot of those different viewpoints into the consolidated framework that we have. And if I can be really bold, I'm going to pick on some of the questions in the chat as well. Andrea, is that all right? Great.
Absolutely.
Just because I saw a question about the service provider framework in terms of the audience. And I think absolutely first and foremost, we want this to be useful for service providers themselves, so that outcomes-based partnerships can sometimes seem like a intimidating wall of new, and we're trying to break down that wall and say, actually, no, this is a journey into engaging with outcomes-based partnerships, and we hope that this tool is useful in that. Having said that, we also hope that it's useful for organisations looking to support service providers, whether those are investors or performance management intermediaries or other kinds of organisations, also potentially even government or outcomes funders who are looking to commission outcomes-based partnerships. So primarily service providers, but then quite a broad range of other organisations as well. I can also pick on my colleagues to answer other questions in the chat. Louise and Marielle, do you want to take the question on ecosystem readiness and national and subnational?
Yes, thank you, Louise. So Rick, you're asking, for everyone to know, you're asking whether we have any observations about ecosystem readiness within regional and local context, as opposed to readiness for outcome-based partnerships at a national or central government level. So probably the first thing to say here is that we believe that these frameworks are useful for both national and subnational levels or ecosystems. Of course, there might be differences between one and both in terms of the stakeholders who are within the ecosystem, the different regulations or the different systems that exist at both levels. But we believe that these frameworks are useful for both levels, both the national and the subnational. From my point of view, and probably Louise also has a view on this, thinking of a regional ecosystem that goes beyond the national level might be a little bit different, in the sense that you might be dealing with different governments, different regulatory frameworks, different systems that might not always be the same. So it might be a little bit more challenging to think in that type of ecosystem beyond the national or the subnational level. So all this to say that we believe that these tools might be helpful in both cases, and hopefully they can help stakeholders at both levels to address the different points to develop outcome-based partnerships. Louise, I don't know if you want to add anything additional to this point.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think what's interesting, if we look at national contexts where there have been real efforts to develop, if you like, capabilities around outcomes-based partnership development and launch at more local levels, particularly. And the UK is a good example of this, but I think there's also a couple of examples in Latin America where this has been tried. And I think what's interesting, and what's hopefully helpful about these frameworks is that where there might be a central government intent to support more local commissioning of outcomes-based partnerships, these frameworks can hopefully inform some of the ways that they might think about strengthening local capacity in order to do that. So in some cases that might be co-funding for outcome payments or co-funding for design, but actually it can also be around sort of more technical support, if you like, around helping local governments or more local level institutions to develop their competencies around procurement of outcomes-based contracts, multi-stakeholder governance, management of cross-sector partnerships. You know, I think there's a whole number of competencies that are outlined in these frameworks that have relevance, as Maria said, from sort of national all the way down to really quite local levels.
Andrea, there are a couple of other questions in the chat. I don't know if you have time.
I think Laura was going to
sorry,
manage the rest of the questions. So thanks, Marielle.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think Rory had a question. So Rory, if you want to come take yourself off mute, feel free to ask the question to the speakers.
Hi, thanks. My name is Rory and I work at the GoLab. I'm interested in public procurement, but also, of course, outcomes-based contracting. And my question is about the sort of promise of this work. I mean, do you believe that the projects that you might actually start improve the ecosystem that you're looking at? How so? And, you know, what are the mechanisms for that? And then are you looking at, like, okay, this was the state of the ecosystem before, and now this is the state of this ecosystem afterwards? And then is that improvement really limited to just the projects that are actually, or the organizations that are involved in a project and just that project? Or is there some kind of wider capacity development that happens as a result of these projects? If so, what are the mechanisms that allow that, and how do you know?
That's a big question, Rory, and a really fun one from my point of view. So I think one of the pieces of work that we were doing in parallel with developing these frameworks is a bit of thinking around that, around what might a kind of conceptual framework for thinking about social outcomes, contracts, and system strengthening, what might that look like? And that work hasn't yet been published. We're going to be working with GoLab to consult on that over the summer, with, I think, a view to launching that thinking at the Social Outcomes Conference in September. But it speaks to, I think, a number of the questions that you're asking here. So we can hopefully start to shape a little bit of a sense of that. I think in terms of the frameworks themselves, they don't explicitly aim to set out to assess. They're primarily, as Mara said in her introduction to this, being introduced as an attempt to sort of help set a learning and development agenda around building ecosystems for partners that want to move in this direction. But I think there's certainly potential to think about how the frameworks might be applied in ways that facilitate evaluation of the state of a market at a particular point in time, and then the subsequent evaluation of where that is later in its development. In terms of thinking about sort of mechanisms through which social outcomes contracts and outcomes-based partnerships might strengthen ecosystems, I think our experience of operating these kinds of partnerships, and I mean, we've got a very rich set of stakeholders on the call today, so it would be interesting to hear other views on this. I think from our perspective, we see really two routes to that. I think we see a route that results in, if you like, improved policy and service design. So through the use of outcomes-based partnerships, which create that space for adaptive delivery, for innovation and flexible delivery, there's that scope to sort of iterate and refine models of service delivery, maybe in a more radical way than maybe fee-for-service contracts would allow. So I think that's one potential route that we see. I think the second route that we see is really around strengthening potentially ecosystem capacity for policy implementation more broadly. And that might take a number of forms. It might look like strengthened mechanisms for cross-sector partnerships, whether within or outside of an outcomes-based partnership per se. It might look like strengthened systems for data-driven service delivery and learning and those adaptive cycles. And it might also look like a shift in the basis of accountability for public spending, away from maybe where the service is delivered in the way that we thought they would be, and towards actually accountability on the ground for whether anything changed in the service user lives. So I think we see at least two really kind of substantive pathways in which actually using outcomes-based partnerships and strengthening the ecosystem use of that might in turn strengthen, I guess, kind of more broadly a system's capacity for effective policy implementation. But I think, there hasn't been a huge amount of evaluation looking at that to date. And I think our hope would be that might happen over the coming months and years.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Rory, and you, Louise. We've got a raised hand. Matthew, would you like to unmute yourself? We've just got enough time for a couple more questions. We'll do Matthew, and then we've got Sanya. Apologies if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, but I know that you've asked a couple of questions in the chat, so we can pass to you as well. So yeah, over to you, Matthew.
Thanks a lot. Hi, Matthew here from the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. I'm just curious about kind of the feedback that you've received from service providers themselves, because seen one way, an outcomes-based contract is going to place an additional risk and cost on a service provider. So for the same project, they're suddenly held to kind of a higher standard, and there's a risk that, if they miss the outcome, then obviously it will cause problems for them. So, I mean, two things could happen. Number one, in an environment where you have limited supply of high quality providers, you may have the high quality providers being able to negotiate out of these types of contracts, and then essentially you'll be left with a pool of service providers that have no choice but to opt into them, but are then of lower quality. And or you may see kind of an increase in the cost of providing services, as has happened actually just in the private sector consulting model. Whenever kind of the outcomes-based contracts are introduced, they just end up charging essentially much more to cater for the risk that the outcomes won't be met. So I was just wondering, just on the incentive side for the service providers, whether you'd come across these issues and what could be done about them. Also quite a big question, sorry.
Thanks, Matthew. I'm happy to have a first go at that. Really interesting question. I would say, I mean, Celeste as well, I don't want to steal your thunder from the panel discussion, but I would say in general, it's more about the opportunity that these kinds of contracts provide to service providers, in that compared to other forms of programming, there's so much more flexibility. So if you have a mission-driven organization that is really interested in learning, in adapting, in improving their delivery, then these kinds of partnerships can really provide that flexibility, and that's a real positive. I think in terms of kind of crowding out or distorting the market, I'd say in most contexts so far, we're not really at the stage where there are so many of these kinds of partnerships and contracts out there that's necessarily a force that we've seen so far. And I think it's, in terms of increasing the costs, again, it's kind of, I mean, I'd be really interested in others' views on this as well, but my reflection would be that because, you know, there have been a number of examples across different countries, different sectors of these kinds of partnerships, but they're not so universal that we have lots of different outcomes prices in similar contexts that can be easily compared. We're not kind of at that stage yet. And so there isn't necessarily that market shift, which potentially could happen. I can't predict the future, but I don't think we're at that stage at the moment. And I would say, from my experience, the overwhelming sort of factor or force from a service provider point of view is more around the opportunities that these kinds of partnerships can bring. Louise or Marielle, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
I think just two additional thoughts, I guess. One, on the point of crowding out potentially, and whether high quality providers choose to opt out of these kinds of contracts. I mean, I think somewhat as Mara was saying, I think in her introduction to this session, I think you know, it's certainly possible to design outcomes-based partnerships badly as well as with any form of contract. And I think ideally, if you design them well, and both the outcomes that you're targeting, but also the payments that you're offering for those outcomes are appropriate, then ideally, actually, I would hope that what you end up doing is crowding out over time the less effective providers rather than crowding out the most effective providers, because actually by fundamentally shifting the basis of accountability for those providers away from can you deliver to time and budget a particular predefined set of activities, and towards actually saying, you know what we really care about is whether you're shifting the needle on delivering better outcomes for a population, then ideally what you do is crowd out the less effective providers rather than crowd out the more effective ones. So I guess that would be my first thought there. I think on the cost side of things, I think that's tricky. I think often governments and donor agencies don't fully understand the costs that they have spent on, I guess, more conventionally commissioned projects, particularly I think when it comes to taking into consideration their own time and effort, both in terms of the design and in terms of contract management, and in terms of failure, actually. You know, I think very often the projects that get touted around are the ones that have been either huge successes or huge failures. And it can very often be really, really hard to get a sense of, well, what's the average spend for a particular agency or a particular government on a particular outcome? Because you either see we spend, you know, very little delivering brilliant outcomes, or we spend a lot delivering nothing. And you kind of don't see anything in between. It's binary. Whereas what we actually need to know in terms of value for money is what's that median spend. I think we've seen some agencies and governments addressing the issue Caitlin raised around, to some extent, the fact that this is quite an early market, by saying, well, we know what we've paid historically on a different service basis, on a fee-for-service basis. And so actually we're going to cap our outcome spending at that level. And therefore we know that anything that we're delivering beyond that is de facto offering better value for money. So I think there's but you know, it is still a fairly early stage of the market. But I hope those are helpful thoughts.
Thanks so much for that, Louise. That's really, really helpful. We've got a very interesting panel discussion coming up. So I would love to let Sanya ask her any questions, but just we'll kind of keep it to a couple minutes if possible. But yeah, Sanya, over to you. You have a couple questions already in the chat.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for your presentation, a very interesting conversation. So I'm actually a development practitioner. I've worked in a rural development agency, and I think it's really an exciting idea of trying to refocus the contracting, so to speak, from activities to outcomes. And I'm also currently an MPP candidate, so I'm studying public policy at the United Nations University in Netherlands. So we're very focused on the SDGs. So I think, again, very exciting maybe idea to look at sustainable development goals and those outcomes, those indicators as something that we want to achieve and trying to pay for that. But I see there's a lot of problems here, which I think can only be dealt with experimentation. For example, how to really set up those terms of references and so on. I was wondering, so if you see any added potential in some sectors, some examples you could show, and do you have you had some partners in developing countries as well? Do you see any demand there as well? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Sanya. Those are great questions. So to take your last point first, yes, I think many of us that will speak on the panel today have experience of working with these kinds of structures in lower middle income countries. So hopefully through the panel discussion, you'll get a bit more of a sense of that. I think you're right that there's still a high degree of experimentation involved in some of these contracts at the moment. And I think in terms of, I mean, I guess when we, and I'm now speaking with a social finance hat on, when we are thinking about, you know, is an outcomes-based approach right for a particular social issue? Our starting point tends to be to think about, you know, the nature of the problem that you're trying to solve. And I think what we have ended up finding over a number of years of working in this space is that actually these kinds of outcomes-based structures make most sense, and the effort that goes into structuring and managing them makes most sense, where you're trying to address issues and or population needs that are really quite complex, where there isn't a very mechanistic sort of understanding of intervention A leads to outcome B. Now, sometimes that might be because the context is quite volatile, and actually what's helpful in that context is an interventional service delivery approach that is flexible and adaptive, that can move with changes. And actually COVID has provided some really interesting examples of that over the last couple of years, particularly in things like the employment sector, where structurally where employment has been and the mechanisms through which populations can engage with employment have changed really quite radically. And I think it's been really exciting to see how some of the live outcomes-based partnerships that have been operating through that period have used that flexibility to adapt and still deliver really very impressive outcomes. I think, you know, there are other aspects to that complexity. So some of that might be population needs, and quite often we find that outcomes-based partnerships are being applied to social issues where maybe there's a more mainstream intervention or funding approach that works for 80% of the population, but that there's a subsector of the population that may have quite different needs to the majority, where actually a new approach is needed, and actually what works for that population maybe isn't so well understood. So I think for us, those are really kind of useful ways to think about where these kinds of contracts can add value. And I think, you know, education, employment, health, these are sectors where we've seen these contracts being applied to good effect in a lot of lower middle income countries. I don't know whether Maria or Caitlin, you have any other insights on that, or whether maybe Andrea, that's a good point to open it to the panel more broadly.
Thanks, Louise. That is a beautiful segue into our panel discussion. And huge thanks to you, Caitlin and Mariale, for such thoughtful responses. It's been a really great discussion so far, and it's only going to get better because we're now going to be joined by 6 additional and absolutely brilliant experts coming from very different backgrounds. As you'll know, if you've joined previous sessions of our Engaging with Evidence series, we always seek to complement the insights discussed in the part 1 of the session with the lived experience of practitioners and other experts in the field. So it's my great pleasure to moderate all-female superstars panel. Laura, I think you've got a slide with our lovely panelists, and I'll invite everyone to introduce themselves very briefly in a moment. Just before we do that, do keep asking questions in the chat. Raise your hand if you do want to ask a question or share a thought. I know lots of you on the call have lots of experience on outcomes-based contracts and partnerships, and it would be great to hear how the findings from the 2 frameworks resonate with your own work. Just to try to bring a little bit of structure to the discussion, we thought of organizing the part 2, the discussion, around 3 core questions. One is around the lived experience, the kind of international perspectives, challenges on the ground, but also examples of best practice. So we'll hear in a moment from some of our speakers around what these questions about building ecosystem readiness and capability looks like on the ground. We then want to spend a little bit of time also discussing in more detail what service provider readiness looks like and how it fits into the wider considerations around ecosystem readiness. And then finally, we'll come on to questions around building capacity. As we've mentioned throughout the session, we really hope these tools will be used to inform future capacity building efforts. So again, we'll hear from our panelists on this. So without further ado, I'll invite each of our new panelists to introduce themselves, and I'll go in alphabetical order. So Celeste, I'll come to you first, and Mila and Mara.
Hi, everybody. Great to join this conversation. I'm Celeste Brubaker, and I work with Village Enterprise. Village Enterprise works on improving the well-being of the extreme poor, and we've just completed the first impact bond for poverty alleviation in sub-Saharan Africa, taking place in Uganda and Kenya.
Thanks, Celeste. Over to you, Mila.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Mila, I head of Business Outcomes Partnerships, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And yes, we're a non-for-profit which works to help improve public services through catalytic activities, be it pooling funding that can support outcomes-based partnerships, or working on sharing the learning and figuring out how collectively we can move the agenda of more effective public services and ultimately better outcomes and better outcomes for people and better value for the government forward.
Great to have you on the session, Mila. And with that, we're over to Mara.
Hi everyone, I'm Mara Iroldi. I'm the academic director of the Government Outcomes Lab, and Andrea introduced the work that we do.
Thanks, Mara. We didn't make a slide for you because we thought you need no presentation. Right, over to Nicole, then Radana, then Vera.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Nicole Pflock, Associate Partner at Instiglio. And at Instiglio, we work with governments, funders, and service providers to assess kind of the rationale for outcomes-based partnerships and help them to design and implement those. And we focus on low and middle income countries.
Thanks, Nicole.
Hi everybody, Radana Kruba. I lead the Impact Investing team in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. As those who regularly attend these engaging with evidence sessions, so regular visitors to the GoLab website know, we have been piloting impact bonds, but also other outcomes-based partnerships, and are now on the journey towards looking to scale them with government partners around the world. So really looking forward to talking on the panel today. Thank you.
Thanks, Radana. And last but most certainly not least, Vera.
Thank you, Andrea. Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with these lovely ladies, and I am a lawyer and a researcher and a professor of administrative law at São Paulo Law School of FGV. I'm also a 2022 visiting fellow of the Lehman Foundation at the Blavatnik School of Government, and I worked as a legal consultant in the first pilot designed in Brazil back to 2015.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vera. And Laura, I think we can stop the screen share now. Brilliant. Sorry, just so I can see everyone. Radana, can I come to you first before we go into the detail of some of the examples that we want to discuss? You've been a pioneer and leading force in this space for quite some years now. I know we have veterans on the session with us, but maybe for those who are a bit newer to this universe, could you give us an overview of the efforts to date around, I suppose, ecosystem consolidation and coordination as well? And then a follow-up question around, I guess, how progress have we made so far? What have been some of the successes, and where do we still have barriers? I know, really big questions.
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant, Andrea, very much. And actually, before I start, let me just take a moment to thank GoLab for convening the session, but also thank social finance colleagues for this brilliant and all the work on developing these frameworks, which I wanted to reflect on just very in a couple of minutes. So first of all, in many ways for me, reading the paper, reading the frameworks, especially the one on ecosystem building, has been a little bit like watching a nature documentary. So something that kind of charts one's own experiences, though, in the wilderness of outcomes-based financing, but in a very calm voice, then goes on to explain to you how you fit into the ecosystem, that actually an order exists, and then you can start recognizing the patterns and really calm down about the experience you've just been through. And that is exactly because we've attempted at really looking at building capacity and building skills, first of all, by doing this, right, by piloting impact bonds ourselves within our development work. So building, yes, on some of the experiences in the UK domestically, really trying to take this experience internationally into our official development assistance portfolio. So a couple of things that particularly struck me about this, and I think reflect our own experience very well, is first of all how little you need to get started, right? And that's the first step in the first level of ecosystem of the ecosystem framework. So of course, funding and willingness to give this a go, you know, senior level buy-in and a team that's able to execute. You need to be sure that the regulation in country and wherever you're working doesn't completely forbid this. And I'd argue that this is the one, especially if you're a government funder, no matter whether it's national or local, that one's especially important. And when we talk about regulation, don't think this is some, you know, really complex set of primary and secondary legislation you're going to have to read. Simply, this is looking at your contract and grant conditions within your organization. You know, will your finance team permit this? Will your procurement colleagues agree that participating in these contracts doesn't actually contravene any rules that are set internally? Data availability, of course, hugely important to us. I would say it's almost on the data availability piece. It's been the case of assessing your ability or your risk appetite to go and take your own decisions based on really at times incomplete information. So a lot of judgment required there in terms of what data do I know, what data do I have to take part in these in outcome-based partnerships. Is this enough? Can I sign an agreement based on the outcomes I'm about to pay for and based on behaviors that I'm looking for providers to exhibit? So really, you know, if you think about it, there really aren't that many conditions, and a lot of that is introspection really within your own organization. But from then on, expanding the ecosystem, I would say it's a far more conscious effort. So 3 things that we've done here, or 3 points of engagement. First of all, within FCDO, we've done a bit of this work internally. So sharing first case studies from our pilots, sharing even anecdotal evidence and ideally evaluations, which are starting to come through as well, building awareness, appetite within the organization. That's really FCDO specific. And it's been important in that, I think, to present all our work, not in isolation, but actually within this broader ecosystem of outcomes-based partnerships and looking at drawing on other experiences. So as a result of that, colleagues in our team in Nairobi have now been able to go and test an impact bond in sexual and reproductive health. Our humanitarian team are looking at innovative finance mechanisms in the demining space. So we've really had colleagues all over the world, you know, at least equipped to assess these opportunities. So a lot of that internal work has I do believe, led to that. Externally, then, I would highlight our support to the Education Outcomes Fund specifically, which has enabled us to take our case of outcomes-based partnerships directly to governments in particular Sierra Leone and Ghana so far. The regulatory questions there, I think, only grow in complexity, right, and are very, very context specific, but we're definitely already picking out some patterns there. Again, procurement rules, where do they reflect ours? Where are they slightly different? The appetite from government is a very similar thing. And what's that appetite based on? Is it actually governments looking to drive better outcomes or get better accountability and transparency on their in their commissioning? And are those governments subject to any other rules apart from their own? For example, where they use World Bank funding, right, or collaborate through multilateral international institutions. So I think one has to be a lot more mindful, and this space, I think, is really a little more complex than we expected. Finally, I think it's, of course, it's really difficult to reach all stakeholders in this thankfully growing space and get results across building the entire ecosystem. But to that end, we've at least done a little bit of convening through an impact bonds working group, where we're looking to gather service providers, investors, donors, governments, really, to go and share insight, share experiences, share really any kind of anything, and be it data or be it just anecdote on participating in the market. And based on at least feedback so far from the first few meetings we've had, that's tremendously useful to people too. So don't underestimate the power of kind of anecdote, but I think having this framework and being able to order the anecdote into these categories will be useful. Of course, from then on, the kind of documentary comparison ceases to exist for me at CDO, because we're still very, very far away from your final step, and that's the consolidation part. But I think still really useful to see a framework there, and maybe for us that will be more of a map for things that might be critical for our success there as well. So I'll leave it there, but I know that there are others, especially looking at the UK market, but looking internationally too, who will have good insights.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Rodana. So to the point of looking internationally, I'd like to go to Nicole next. I thought it's quite funny that Rodana started by saying that it's surprising how little you need to get started. So Nicole, I'd love your perspective on getting started, getting pilots off the ground, and some of the key ingredients around making it all happen.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Yeah, I think we have touched on many of these factors actually already, but I think as many have emphasized, in our experience, I think the most critical factor to launch a pilot project, but then also subsequently to really build the ecosystem, is the interest and buy-in from stakeholders, right? And the interest and buy-in or willingness to embark on this journey with an innovation, learning, and problem-solving mindset. As well as their capacity to bring, to really invest in building the right capacities and infrastructure over time. So then if kind of this buy-in is so critical, I think it's important to start when developing those projects with the question of how exactly outcomes-based partnerships can help stakeholders achieve their objectives, and to kind of build some common vision or clarity around like what we are actually trying to achieve, and what how outcomes-based partnerships fit into that broader picture of the objectives. And then I think that long-term vision will also help to approach this development of pilots with an investment mindset, right? Because initially, I would say that the cost of structuring those mechanisms, to investing in building capacities, for example, of service providers, to invest maybe in robust verification methodologies to give everyone confidence around the results that have been achieved. Those costs are likely high compared to kind of the observed improvements that you can achieve from those mechanisms, in particular because initially you probably want to pilot them at a small scale, right? So having that long-term vision and investment mindset, I think, is really important when starting on that journey. And so to take maybe one of the examples, the launch of the first social impact bond in Colombia, but also subsequently the development of the ecosystem, hugely benefited from some champions in the government, but then also from the significant and long-term support of funders. So the IDB lab and SECO provided the necessary resources to really secure the technical and legal assistance to create a robust design despite limited available data, for example, and to also invest in that robust verification mechanism that would give everyone like confidence on the results. And they also provided matching funds to pay for results, which was really important to both like secure the commitment from the government, but also to overcome some of the legal barriers that we were facing, or that the government was facing, to allocate funding for a multi-year project. And the additional benefit was that it allowed to reduce the non-disbursement risk that the government is facing when shifting from paying for inputs and activities where they have a lot of kind of visibility, to now shifting to results which are a little bit more uncertain. So that was achieved by, for example, really focusing and structuring the mechanism in a way where the government would pay for the first results achieved at the beginning of the project, and then the donor funding would come in towards the end to pay for the second round of results. And while that is maybe not a sustainable solution for later on scaling that mechanism, it was really critical to launch the first social impact bond, right? And to demonstrate the benefits that those mechanisms can have. And doing so alongside the government was also really important to make sure that the design was relevant for the public policy questions that the government is actually facing. And then one additional aspect that I would that I think was highlighted earlier as well, and that I would like to touch on, is the availability of reliable data to set targets, to price outcomes. And this is usually a challenge in designing those mechanisms, and in particular in low and middle income countries where we work, I think the availability of data is often scarce. But then in addition to kind of like really trying to leverage all the available data and triangulating that and potentially investing in a baseline data to get more certainty around this, I think it's really important as well to keep in mind that outcome-based contracts can be adapted to each context. So for example, I think there was an earlier question previously around like the risk that service providers are exposed to, and outcome-based contracts can be designed to limit that risk, for example, by tying less of the funding to the actual outcomes that we want to achieve. So just tying a small percentage of the funding to the outcomes that we want to encourage will still go a long way in drawing kind of the attention to those outcomes, while limiting kind of the inherent risk of setting targets and pricing in low data environments. Similarly, I think you can design mechanisms in a way where you allow service providers to compensate for overperformance on one outcome matrix with underperformance on another outcome matrix, which was maybe due to setting overly ambitious targets because of the lack of data. And then lastly, I think it's also about defining how to allocate those initial risks that you're facing in those pilot projects. And I think here, foundations and socially minded investors, if they are needed in the structures, can really support the creation of a market by taking on some of these initial risks, particularly if it's related to kind of just like not having the right data, maybe to set the most rigorous performance targets or prices. And yeah, I don't know if should I stop here? Would love to share one additional thought, but I think I've been talking for quite a bit already.
Well, thanks, Nicole. That's super interesting. If there's anything you didn't get a chance to mention, do feel free to use the chats. And if anyone in the audience has any questions, reflections, anything maybe you disagree with, do engage with us. So staying on the Latin American continent, Vera, I'd like to come to you next, and it would be great to hear a bit more about the experience with impact bonds and Brazil. Nicole's mentioned government buy-in and support as one of the most important factors. Does that resonate with the experience in Brazil?
Yeah, actually we had two experiences in Brazil and both failed. That's the bad news. The first one started in late 2015 in my birth state, São Paulo, so it was a local level. And it was a task force between IDB and IFC, and Social Finance UK was within the group as well. And they developed what I would say the first social impact bond in the state of São Paulo in the educational field. I joined the task force as a legal consultant, and this outcome-based contract was designed to decrease dropout rates at public schools and also to improve educational performance for high school students. The pilot took about a year or maybe a year and a half, and all the documents were prepared for the public bid. But the pilot was cancelled in 2017 when the term of the governor ended. So the political time did not match the time of the project. And there was another thing that I must say, that the teachers' union was against the project. Not really the project, but the union was bargaining best conditions, and it was the perfect moment to bring the questions they were raising. The second pilot project we had in Brazil happened at the national level, at the federal level, and it was way more simple than the first one. It was a project developed by the team of the Ministry of Economy at the federal level, as I just mentioned, and the contract was signed in December 2019 after a public bid. It was a reverse bid. And the goal of this contract was to provide services to facilitate the employment of unemployed young people. Then the pandemic came in January 2022. The contract was terminated by the federal government, and no outcome came from this contract. What have I learned from those cases, and what are the barriers I faced? Well, I would say the lessons is first, there is a big fear of new arrangements, and that fear of new arrangements doesn't allow government to looking forward innovation. When I mean fear of the control bodies, and specifically of the public audit courts. Public managers, they do fear the control bodies, and they, at least in Brazil, they are always trying to find ordinary arrangements to improve ideas, not innovation arrangements. Secondly, I would say, as I mentioned, the political time is different from the time needed to mature the project in terms of bankability and impact assessments. And also, there were high costs to design the partnership, as qualified consultants are expensive, and the development of the project involves a lot of time. Third, I would say that in Brazil, even though legislative changes are not strictly necessary for the implementation of social impact bonds, I do understand that the approval of federal law or maybe a local statute on the subject would bring more legal certainty to this type of social investment. It would be nice to have it more institutionalized and standardized to help public managers to decide to make decisions more comfortable. Fourth, both pilots, and this is something that I didn't see anybody that spoke before me tackle. Both pilots of social impact bonds happened to design the delivery of services that were already provided by nonprofit organizations, raising the question of public spending. Why should the government spend public money in a service that somehow is provided by its nonprofit organizations? And fifth, the important role of a pilot. The pilot really have a lack of, can bring all the evidence to stimulate senior government officials to go after this type of arrangement. And finally, but not least, what I would like to say is that at the end, another topic very important is that all this investment that IDB, Social Finance UK, and IFC did in Brazil, especially in the state of São Paulo, were to public managers that are no longer in charge. We do need to have permanent public servants in charge, and the knowledge has to be shared After all, I would say all the sponsors lost their investment in Brazil, as we do not have those people involved in the design of another public outcome-based contracts.
Vera, thanks so much for such a thorough response. It's really great to understand what the situation was in Brazil. So moving on from the government and ecosystem level and delving into the service provider readiness, I'd love to come to Celeste and then Mila for their perspective. Celeste, you're here representing the service provider organization, and just last month we had a whole engaging with evidence session on village enterprise, but it'd be great to get maybe just an overview of what the experience has been with Village Enterprise, maybe how the organization went about assessing their own readiness and deciding to deliver the program through an impact one. And then Mila, you've worked with so many service providers on so many different projects. It'd be great to hear what your experience has been around the key ingredients that we need to have in place to deliver these partnerships in a very successful way. So over to you, Celeste first, and then Mila.
Sure, thanks so much, Andrea. So the impact fund for Village Enterprise, I think really importantly, it was the opportunity we saw is an extremely good strategic fit. Village Enterprise is a mission-driven organization. And so learning that there could be this opportunity to start scaling our program with funding where the results would be tied to the impact that we as an organization are trying to achieve in the world. It sounded like a really amazing opportunity to us. And then also really importantly, we had strong leadership unity around the idea that this is something that would be an amazing opportunity for us. As an organization, we were in the fortunate position that we had actually just been completing our first randomized controlled trial in Uganda when we were really getting going with the discussions and the design work for this impact bond project. And so we had the advantage of being able to use our RCT data in modeling as we looked at the feasibility of the parameters that we were putting in place for this new project. I mentioned that to be transparent, but of course not all organizations are going to have the advantage of having RCT data coming in fresh exactly at the time when they're designing the next project. And I think that's okay. A lot of the other elements that have been presented on as part of the framework for service provider readiness. One of the things that we really noticed in our experience is that to a degree, those were there for us, but I think most importantly, those are like data-driven decision-making, organized decentralization of decision-making. Factors like that are things that we had strong organizational alignment around wanting to have and believing that those are things that drive better outcomes. But those are also things that in our impact bond implementing experience, the mechanism of the project itself, actually, it was really transformative and it really helped us improve on all of those areas. And then the improvements that we made while implementing the impact bond, we were then able to take and roll out to the rest of our operations. And so we've come through as a service provider on the other side of the DIB, very inspired for the potential of this type of funding mechanism to really help mission-driven organizations do a better job of achieving their mission. And so as we think about next steps, we want to continue achieving the achieving the impact that we achieve, but doing that while we scale and hopefully also trying to improve the impact that we achieve. And so we're really keen to implement more outcomes-based contracts for ourselves and also to open up the opportunity for other mission-driven organizations like ourselves to also take on this type of funding.
That's great. Well, thanks so much, Celeste. And it's great that other organizations can draw inspiration from the work that you've been doing. Mila, I'll come to you next. And after that, for the last couple of minutes of our time together, we'll go to Mara for final reflections on what we can do with all this information. How can we use it constructively to build a agenda for capacity building in a sustainable way? So first Mila, then Mara.
Thank you, Andrea, so much, and thank you everybody for excellent questions and certainly most fascinating reflections from everybody around the virtual table. And if I'm not wrong, I have like a minute, I think.
Even 2 and 3 will make Mara be very, very brief.
Cool. Okay. Well, I think a lot of what we talked about, a lot of what has been talked about, I want to say that it strongly resonates. And I guess I do have just a few points that I did write down, which we can then talk about later, if relevant. But I guess from our perspective, the key ingredients that we think are really necessary important in making impactful or creating impactful outcome partnerships are related to the ability to have collaborative design, the ability to have ultimately flexible delivery, and the ability to have clearest possible accountability to people through data for progress in learning. And I think, I am very excited to see that a lot of the findings in the framework do indeed very much resonate with what we've been experiencing, which is good to see. But I think what is really important is to think about how some of these points, which sound really obvious and very kind of common sense, and they are, but really thinking about how to make sure and what are some of the barriers that maybe prevent them from happening today. And I think everything that we've heard today does try to address that in terms of, we want to be creating better collaboration in communities. We want to be creating better collaboration with individuals who are delivering the service or ultimately using the service, better collaboration across the government and different parties. And that's, it is really important, like Vera said, to have people consistently present in that partnership to establish that collaboration. And if you do not have that, you need to kind of repeat that relationship building. In flexible delivery, really thinking about the barriers to actually creating that flexible delivery, and the fact that actually in most cases, the more traditional contracts, and in some cases actually outcomes contracts as well, do end up coming with really, really detailed specifications. And if we're saying that ultimately the key ability and the key beauty of this model is that feedback loop that enables you to actually personalize the services, continuously rebudget and redesign, then we do need to make sure that the contractual infrastructure around it does actually allow for that. And there aren't any contractual preventions that would not facilitate this type of flexible delivery. And then from the accountability perspective, we have talked about that already, but again, thinking in practice, how to create those feedback loops which are genuinely embedded in all of the delivery, so that you can have that real-time learning that Celeste was talking about, and that others were also mentioning, and particularly the social finance team in terms of the findings in the framework. In terms of some of the questions that were, oh yes, of course, and in terms of then what underpins all of this, and I think this is some of the well, when we think about the whole system, and exactly as you have talked about it in your framework, it is thinking about how does one orchestrate the system around the partnership, and then how do you have that ongoing adaptive impact management. And the point of culture within the organization and really strong focus in relational leadership is something that in our experience is really critical to make things work effectively. There have been some questions around developed and developing countries. And I guess from our perspective, the way we see it is that really in developed countries, where we've seen these types of partnerships be most effective is where the system is failing the person. And how can you really, the person and the problems are not fitting squarely into one budget envelope and into one particular issue. So how can you actually create that coordination? How can you actually service individuals through very personalized services who have historically fallen through the gaps of the existing systems. And many of the existing systems work perfectly for more straightforward problems, but where you do have a really complex situations and you're in theory meant to interact with a number of different services, then it's a problem. And in developing countries, the way what we're seeing now and what our experience thus far has been is really focusing on the increase on the reach of provision and improvement of the quality of that provision. So it is different type of a problem that this type of a partnership is trying to address. And then finally, I don't have time to talk about this, but I suppose just echoing some of the points that have been happening on the chat, but really, again, a critical ingredient that we feel is really important is that excellent data from all across the delivery and system ecosystem, and figuring out ways as to how to create that connection between the information which is coming from the individuals using the service, from information coming from the frontline teams, local ecosystem around the service, national ecosystem, and finding ways to connect all of that is absolutely critical to amplifying the impact that can be achieved.
Mila,
sorry, I really rushed through that.
No, thank you so much for such a thoughtful response, and it's so helpful to have your perspective on the distinction between high income and low income countries. I know we're slightly over time, apologies. I hate to do that, but I really think it's been really worthwhile to listen to all of our panelists. Before we go to Mara for final reflections, I just wanted to say a huge thanks to everyone. I know we didn't get a chance to answer all the questions in the chat, and thank you so much to our participants for being so engaged. Do reach out to our speakers after the session if you have any questions. I'm sure they're happy to be contacted, and I know in particular Caitlin, Mariale, and Louise are very, very open and keen to get feedback on the readiness framework. So via us or directly through them, do get in touch with them. Huge thanks again to everyone for making time from their busy days to join us. My colleague Laura has dropped a link to a feedback survey on the chat, and I can't stress enough how helpful it is for us to know what you enjoyed, but also what could have been better on these sessions. So without any further comments from me, Mara, over to you for final remarks.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the intent of this framework and the discussion we had to point in that direction. And I will use my University of Oxford the scare impression I give to bring you back to your school desks where you were learning. And there are, I think when we try to learn something, there are two ways in which we learn. One is that we try something, it didn't quite work out, or something worked, some didn't, and we reflect back. So for instance, Vera was mentioning what she learned from trying to launch this, you see the different timelines. Same thing, like you see the test, and you go back, what did I got right, what did I got wrong? So there is this reflexivity that is really important to bring about on projects. But often we underestimate the importance to have clear learning objectives before we go into a learning session. So when we are in school, we are given like, these are the learning objectives, and we think it's boring and it flies over us, but actually being intentional and trying to see, I'm entering these experiences, I'm trying this new project, and this is what I would like to learn, what I expect to learn, really it helps you learning and makes you aware of things that you need to look out for and where you need to focus your attention. So I just want to emphasize that these frameworks that we're putting out are putting out in this spirit. These are things that if you want to really focus on the problem and try to learn from working with an outcome-based partnership, those are things to look out for and be prepared to observe and build capacity on. I think as a research center that does a lot of engagement and capacity building, we think our role is to do both, help reflect on past projects, but also set out a map to help organizations and systems to learn. So we hope this framework serves this purpose. And thank you so much to everybody who contributes in content and in the discussion today.
Thank you, Mara. And again, huge thanks to all our brilliant speakers and to our participants. Apologies for the 5-minute overtime. That's the end of our session, and just hope to see you all on our next Engaging with Evidence seminar. But for now, bye-bye.